नमस्कारः। अद्य अहं संस्कृतस्य प्रभावः मस्तिष्के द संस्कृत इफेक्ट एतस्य विषये मम विचाराः प्रस्तुतं करोमि। Can learning Sanskrit, or Sanskrit as we say in more English world, can it change the brain, and what are its effects, and if those are positive effects, how do we acquire them? नमस्कारः। अद्य वयम् एकं रोचकं प्रश्न विचारयामः। किं संस्कृतभाषा अध्ययनं मस्तिष्कं परिवर्तितुं शक्नोति? किं संस्कृतस्य अध्ययनं स्मरणशक्तिं, एकाग्रतां, भाषाशक्तिं, निर्णयक्षमतां च वर्धयति? किं प्राचीनभारतीयविद्यापद्धतिषु कश्चित् वैज्ञानिकः आधारः आसीत्? We are going to talk about a very fascinating question, that can learning Sanskrit change the brain? Can the study of Sanskrit improve our memory, attention, language abilities, and higher cognitive functions? Were the ancient Indian educational traditions merely cultural practices, or did they contain principles that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand? So first of all, why Sanskrit was revered, so much respected? In the Indian tradition, Sanskrit was never viewed as merely a language. It was a medium through which philosophy, science, medicine, mathematics, spirituality, and the literature were transmitted. The Vedas, Upanishads, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Yoga Sutra, and classical scientific texts were all composed in Sanskrit. Modern scholars believe that language does more than communicate ideas, it shapes the mind itself. And today, neuroscience is beginning to ask similar questions. भारतीय परंपरायां संस्कृतं केवलम् एकं भाषा नासीत्, सा ज्ञानस्य, चिन्तनस्य, दर्शनस्य, विज्ञानस्य च वाहिनी आसीत्। वेदाः, उपनिषदः, महाभारतं, रामायणं, योगशास्त्रम्, आयुर्वेदः, न्यायः, व्याकरणम् एतानि सर्वाणि संस्कृते रचितानि। प्राचीनभारतीयाः मन्यन्ते स्म यत् भाषा केवलं संवादस्य साधनं न, किन्तु मनसः निर्माणस्य अपि साधनम्। So, how the language changes the brain? अद्य ज्ञायते यत् मस्तिष्कः स्थिरः नास्ति, तस्य परिवर्तनशीलता अस्ति। एषा शक्ति न्यूरोप्लास्टिसिटी इति कथ्यते। यदा वयं नूतनां भाषां शिक्षामहे, तदा मस्तिष्कस्य विविधप्रदेशाः पुनर्गठिताः भवन्ति। So, one of the very important discoveries of modern neuroscience is that the brain is is not fixed. It continues to change thanks to the neuroplasticity. It keeps reorganizing itself throughout the life. This ability to reorganize is called, in simple words, this is how I would explain it, neuroplasticity. Learning a new language strengthens networks across various functions like memory, attention, auditory processing, and executive control. Brain imaging studies demonstrate measurable structural and functional changes in people who acquire additional languages. So, what makes Sanskrit unique? What makes it unique? Sanskritasya rachana atyantam vyavasthitam asti. Sanskrit is very well organized, very precise, very beautiful language. People who know its grammar would appreciate why it is so vyavasthitam. Panini maharshina nirmitam vyakaranam vishwasya mahan bodhik chamatkarah manyate. धातवः प्रत्ययाः विभक्तयः समासाः सन्धयः एतेषां नियमाः अत्यन्तं सूक्ष्माः सन्ति. Sanskrit possesses several features that make it intellectually demanding and potentially cognitively enriching. Its grammar its grammar, which is very systematically presented by Panini almost 2,500 years ago, at least, is one of the most sophisticated linguistic systems in the world ever developed. This language requires careful attention to word formation, grammatical transformations, phonetics, sentence structure, and semantic precision. Engaging with such structured complexity involves a very powerful cognitive workout, involves a very important brain's cognitive workout. It provides an excellent workout to the brain. So, let's talk about memory in the Vedic tradition. Vedah सहस्र वर्ष पर्यंतम लिखित रूपेण न संरक्षिताः आसन. For centuries, the Vedas were transmitted orally by memorization, generation after generation. Imagine if knowledge is saved in the form of memory, it will never get lost if it can be transferred generation to generation. If it's written in book, if it's saved in computer, then that knowledge is lost. The moment the computer is hacked or just doesn't function, if its memory system goes haywire, that knowledge, that information is lost. But if it stays in the memory of a human being and is transferred generation after generation, it is not going to be lost. And that is what has happened with Vedic tradition. And it's so impressive to think about how hundreds and hundreds and thousands of Vedic mantras have been transferred generation after generation. We need to understand what changes in memory that allowed people in those days to transfer this kind of information. And very early on, there was one Veda, and it was split into 4 Vedas. And then its sub-branches to allow human beings to remember it by oral tradition. So, Vedah सहस्रवर्षपर्यन्तं लिखितरूपेण न संरक्षिताः आसन्। ते श्रुतेः परम्परया संरक्षिताः। विद्यार्थिनः मन्त्रान् पदपाठेन, क्रमपाठेन, जटापाठेन, धनपाठेन च अधीयन्ते स्म। मानव इतिहासस्य महान् स्मृतिप्रणालीषु एका अस्ति। So for centuries, the Vedas were transmitted orally. Students memorized extraordinarily large bodies of text using sophisticated recitation methods such as the Padapatha, Kramapatha, Jetapatha, and Ghanapatha. These techniques represent one of the most remarkable memory systems in human history. And such training required sustained attention, auditory discrimination, working memory, and error correction. And error correction. So imagine, so let's imagine how the Vedic students must be studying and how they must be building their attention and concentration power early on in their life that would allow them to learn the Vedas and transmit that information generation to generation. And we need to understand, as neuroscientists, as neurologists, we need to understand what is it that we can teach our current generation and future generations so that they have sustained attention, great concentration, plasticity related changes in the brain that will make them supercomputer themselves. We need to really think about this, test this hypothesis in a scientific environment, and train our future generation starting early on in life so that our kids are the smartest people in the world, and what they do leads to the best of the best to the societies we live in, make them a better human being and also intellectual powerhouse. So what does modern neuroscience say about language learning? आधुनिक तंत्र विज्ञानस्य क्षेत्रे द्वौ महान् वैज्ञानिकौ विशेषतया उल्लेखनीयौ स्तः। Alan Bialystok and my friend and colleague Jubin Abutalebi. एतयोः कार्यं मुख्यतया द्विभाषिकत्वस्य मस्तिष्के प्रभाव विवेचयति. So I'm thinking of two very influential neuroscientists, Alan Bialystok and Jubin Abutalebi. Their work has transformed our understanding of how learning and managing multiple languages influences the human brain. Although large-scale studies specifically examining Sanskrit learners are still lacking, bilingualism research provides a useful scientific framework for understanding how Sanskrit education might influence cognition. एलन ब्यालिस्टॉक तथा जुबिन अबुतलेबी एतयोः कार्यं मुख्यतया द्विभाषिकत्वस्य मस्तिष्के प्रभावं विवेचयति. यद्यपि संस्कृताध्ययनस्य विशालाः अध्ययनाः अद्य न सन्ति, तथापि द्विभाषिकत्वविषये प्राप्तानि निष्कर्षाणि संस्कृताध्ययनस्य संभावित प्रभावान् अवगन्तुं साहाय्यं कुर्वन्ति. So what does Alan Bialystok say? about bilingualism and executive control. She suggests, through her research, that lifelong bilingualism can strengthen what neuroscientists call executive control, the set of mental abilities involved in attention, inhibition, task switching, and goal directed behavior. Bialystok महाभागायाः अनुसन्धानेन ज्ञायते यत् द्विभाषिकाः जनाः बहुषु कार्येषु उत्तमाम् executive control शक्तिं प्रदर्शयन्ति. यदा मनुष्यः द्वे भाषे नित्यं प्रयुङ्क्ते तदा सः निरन्तरम् एकां भाषां दमनं कृत्वा अपरां सक्रियकरोति. एषः अभ्यासः ध्यानं, चयनशक्तिं, मानसिकचीलतां च वर्धयति. Bialystok's research suggests that lifelong bilingualism can strengthen the executive control, and as I just mentioned, the set of mental abilities involved in attention, inhibition, task switching, and goal directed behavior. Every bilingual speaker constantly manages a competition between languages. When you are speaking Sanskrit and Hindi or Sanskrit and English, there's one system which is suppressing the other language, which is an extra exercise required on the part of the brain compared to a person who is just a monolingual, who doesn't have to inhibit any other language. So the repeated mental exercise appears to train attentional systems and cognitive control networks. Bialystok has also argued that bilingual experience may contribute to cognitive reserve, helping individuals maintain cognitive performance despite age-related brain changes. यदा मनुष्यः द्वे भाषे नित्यं प्रयुक्ते तथा सः निरन्तरम् एकां भाषां दमनं कृत्वा अपरां सक्रियं करोति. एषः अभ्यासः ध्यानं, चयनशक्तिं, मानसिक लचीलतां च वर्धयति. What has Jubin Abutalebi done and taught about brain plasticity? So Dr. Jubin Abutalebi has been one of the pioneers in demonstrating that bilingualism is associated with measurable changes in brain organization and neuroplasticity. His work suggests that managing multiple languages recruits neural networks involved in attention, conflict monitoring, cognitive control, working memory, and decision making. These are the same brain systems neurologists recognize as critical for concentration, planning, self-regulation, and complex thinking. Jubin Abutalebi महाभागस्य कार्यं दर्शयति यत् द्विभाषिकत्वं केवलं व्यवहारं न परिवर्तयति किन्तु मस्तिष्कस्य रचनाम् अपि प्रभावितुं शक्नोति. तेन दर्शितं यत् द्विभाषिकत्वेन ध्यानं, संघर्षनियन्त्रणं, कार्यस्मृतिः, निर्णयक्षमता च सम्बद्धानि तंत्रिकाजालानि सक्रियाणि भवन्ति. So let's formulate a hypothesis for Sanskrit. यदि द्विभाषिकत्वमेव मस्तिष्के परिवर्तनं जनयति तर्हि संस्कृतस्य दीर्घकालीनाध्ययनं, विशेषतः व्याकरण, स्मरण, मंत्रपाठः च एकं शक्तिशाली संज्ञानात्मक प्रशिक्षण माध्यमं भवितुम् अर्हति. एषा अद्यापि वैज्ञानिक परिकल्पना अस्ति किन्तु सा परीक्षण योग्या अस्ति. If bilingualism alone can induce measurable neuroplastic changes, then long-term Sanskrit training, especially when combined with grammar, memorization, and recitation, may represent a particularly powerful cognitive training paradigm. This remains a hypothesis requiring rigorous scientific testing, but it is a testable hypothesis grounded in contemporary neuroscience. So, Sanskrit is more than a religious language. It is more than a religious language. अद्य बहवः जनाः संस्कृतं केवलं धार्मिकभाषा इति मन्यते. Today, many people associate Sanskrit primarily with religion. किंतु इतिहास भिन्नां कथा वदति. But the history tells us a different story. सहस्रवर्षपर्यन्तं भारतस्य ज्ञानभाषा आसीत् संस्कृतम्. धर्मं दर्शनं गणितं ज्योतिषम् आयुर्वेदः व्याकरणं नाट्यं काव्यं राजनीति न्यायशास्त्रम् अर्थशास्त्रम् सर्वेषां क्षेत्राणां साहित्यं संस्कृत एव विकसितम्. So today, many people associate Sanskrit primarily with religion, and this perception is understandable because Sanskrit remains the language of many prayers, mantras, and sacred texts. All our Hindu sacred texts, Ramayana, Mahabharata, are all in Sanskrit. However, historically, Sanskrit was much more than a religious language. For nearly 2 millennia, Sanskrit served as one of the principal languages of scholarship across the Indian subcontinent. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, linguistics, philosophy, law, literature, political science, agriculture, architecture, music, and logic were all discussed and developed through Sanskrit. And it acts as a bridge across India. भारतस्य भाषाः विविधाः सन्ति. हिंदी, मराठी, बांग्ला, असमिया, ओडिया, गुजराती, कन्नड़, तेलुगु, मलयालम. एतासां बहूनां भाषाणां शब्दसम्पत्तौ संस्कृतस्य महान् प्रभावः दृश्यते. India is home to extraordinary linguistic diversity, yet many Indian languages share a significant Sanskrit vocabulary. Whether one speaks Hindi in the north, Marathi in the west, Bengali in east, or Kannada and Telugu in the south, countless words trace their roots to Sanskrit. This does not diminish the uniqueness of regional languages. Rather, it highlights Sanskrit's historical role as a shared intellectual and cultural resource. If there is a language that can unite us, the Indians, that's Sanskrit. It can serve as a bridge, not replacing India's languages, but helping us appreciate the connections among them. So, why Sanskrit still matters today? Why does it matter today? Why does it matter today? Kechan vadanti, some people may ask, Sanskritam prachina bhasha asti adya tasya kim prayojanam? If Sanskrit is ancient, what practical value does it have today? Uttaram api rochakam asti. The answer lies not only in tradition, but also in education and intellectual development. संस्कृताध्ययनं छात्राणां भाषाबोधं व्याकरणै पुण्यं तार्किकचिन्तनं भारतीयज्ञानपरम्परायाः प्रत्यक्षपरिचयं च वर्धयति. Studying Sanskrit can help students understand the roots of many Indian languages, develop grammatical precision, cultivate disciplined thinking, and engage directly with India's literary and scientific heritage. If you know Sanskrit, you don't need interpreted books. Meaning is lost in translation, as we say. Sanskrit belongs to everyone. संस्कृतस्य अध्ययनं कस्यचित् धर्मविशेषस्य स्वामित्वं नास्ति. भाषा सर्वेषां भवति. ज्ञानं सर्वेषां भवति. It should not be viewed as belonging to exclusively to one group. A language is a vehicle of knowledge. Anyone, regardless of religion, ethnicity, nationality, or background, can study Sanskrit and benefit from the intellectual traditions preserved within it. One does not need to become a theologian to study Sanskrit, just as one does not need to become a monk to study Latin or ancient Greek. So, where can one do Sanskrit study? Where to go for studying it? यदि भवन्तः संस्कृताध्ययनम् आरब्धुम् इच्छन्ति संस्कृताध्ययनम् आरब्धुम् इच्छन्ति तर्हि अद्य भारते तथा विश्वे अनेकानि उत्कृष्टानि संस्थानानि सन्ति. संस्कृतस्य अध्ययनं केवलं पण्डितानां कृते नास्ति. चिकित्सकाः, वैज्ञानिकाः, अभियन्तारः, शिक्षकाश्च अपि संस्कृतम् अधीयते. So if you are interested in learning Sanskrit, there has never been a better time actually. Sanskrit is studied not only in traditional schools by traditional scholars, but also by physicians, scientists, engineers, linguists, and educators. I can name few universities in India like Sampurnanand Sanskrit University. It is actually one of the world's most respected center of Sanskrit learning. Banaras Hindu Vishwavidyalaya combines traditional Sanskrit scholarship with modern academic research. Rashtriya Sanskrit Samsthan. It's one of the India's largest institutions devoted to Sanskrit education and research. Sanskrit Bharati, Chinmaya International Foundation, Kavi Kulaguru Kalidasa Sanskrit University. And then there are international universities as well where Sanskrit is actively studied, like Oxford, Harvard, Chicago University, Heidelberg University, Cambridge. मम दृष्ट्या संस्कृतस्य महान् उपकारः केवलम् अतीतस्य अध्ययनं नास्ति. संस्कृतम् अस्मान् चिन्तयितुं शिक्षयति, सूक्ष्मतया विचारयितुं शिक्षयति, सावधानतया वक्तुं शिक्षयति. अन्ते अहम् एतदेव वदामि, संस्कृतं केवलम् अतीतस्य धरोहरः नास्ति, संस्कृतं भविष्यस्य अपि साधनं भवितुम् अर्हति. In my view, the greatest gift of Sanskrit is not merely that it connects us to the past, it teaches us how to think. It teaches precision. It teaches attention. It teaches intellectual discipline. And in age increasingly characterized by distraction, those qualities may be more valuable than ever. The quality of precision, attention, intellectual discipline. These values are more valuable today. Let me end with just saying that Sanskrit is not merely a legacy of the past, it may also become a tool for building the future. अद्य अहं संस्कृतस्य विषये अधिकं वक्तुम् इच्छामि. I want to speak a little bit more about Sanskrit. संस्कृतस्य प्रभावः मस्तिष्के किं भवति? So, first of all, why I myself became interested in this question. बाल्ये एवं मम मातरं मम हस्ते भगवद्गीतायाः एकं पुरातनं संस्करणं न्यधात्। तत् ग्रन्थं प्रतिदिनं पठामि स्म। तदा न जानामि स्म यत् एषा भाषा कदाचित् मम जीवनस्य महत्वपूर्णः भागः भविष्यति। And Sanskrit is more than religion. It can contribute to India's unity. भारतस्य विविधता असाधारणा अस्ति। भाषा भिन्नाः, परम्पराः भिन्नाः, किन्तु संस्कृतं तासां मध्ये एकं बौद्धिक सूत्रम् आसीत्। I spoke about the science behind neuroplasticity, the work done by scientists like Bialystok in Canada, Abutalebi, a professor in Italy. I discussed about cognitive reserve. I mentioned about the Vedic memory system, Padapat, Kramapat, Jatapat, Ghanapat. And I would encourage you to study more about this aspect, about Avadhana, how Avadhana contributes to concentration and thus makes your brain a powerhouse, improves memory, actually. The question is not whether these methods, Padapat, Kramapat, Jatapat, Ghanapat, preserved information. They clearly did. The scientific question is, what does this type of training does to the brain? What does it do to the brain? So there's a new scientific frontier that's opened, and I would encourage our Sanskrit community to investigate and further understand how the modern neuroscience can be used to better understand the impact of active bilingualism, Sanskrit music, its power related to meditation and memory training, how they can be tested, proven to demonstrate their positive effect on brain function. Questions are, could Sanskrit represent a unique model of cognitive training? Could it strengthen attention? Could it improve cognitive reserve? Could it contribute to healthy aging? We haven't proven them yet using the modern Western scientific methodology. But we do know from literature, Vedic literature and other literature, how those exercises contribute to focused attention, sustained attention, memory, and those features which are very critical for our high brain performance. I discussed about where one can go for learning Sanskrit. Universities like Sampurnanand Vishwavidyalaya, PHU, Sanskrit Bharati helps the community learn to speak Sanskrit. Sanskritam kevalam mantranaam bhasha nasti, Sanskritam kevalam atitasya bhasha nasti. संस्कृतं चिन्तनस्य भाषा अस्ति, ज्ञानस्य भाषा अस्ति, मानव निर्माणस्य भाषा अस्ति. So, Sanskrit is just not a language for prayers. It is not merely a language of the past. It is a language of thought, a language of knowledge, a language that helped shape one of humanity's main intellectual traditions. As a neurologist, I'm fascinated by how the brain changes through learning. As a student of Sanskrit, I'm fascinated by how language shapes thoughts. Perhaps the meeting of these two worlds will teach us something important, not only about Sanskrit, but also about human mind itself. Thank you. Thank you so much. With this, I will stop here. I welcome any questions, comments, collaboration, an opportunity to speak on these topics. I can be reached through my website, ivpandit.com, through email, nishant.mishra@ivpandit.com, or nishmishra@gmail.com, nishmishra@gmail.com. Harihi Om. Namaskar.